August 1942. Churchill pushed a plan across the table. Bold, urgent, necessary. The forces aren't ready. Again, this was the 15th plan blocked in 3 months. Every operation questioned. Every timeline extended. Every bold move stopped. One believed speed would win the war. The other believed speed would lose it. By September, one of them would be gone. Not because he was wrong, because he was right too often. If you're still here, you're the kind of person who wants the full story, not the sanitized version. Hit like so this doesn't get buried by the algorithm. Subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Now let's go back to 1942. By mid-1942, the language inside British war rooms had changed. The words used in meetings were different. Not dramatically, but noticeably. Phrases like holding position and defensive preparation appeared less frequently. New terms emerged: offensive capability, strategic initiative, window of opportunity. The shift was subtle, but it signaled something larger. Britain was no longer only defending. It was beginning to consider what came next. And that consideration introduced a new kind of tension, one that had nothing to do with enemy action. At the center of the highest level planning sat one man whose job was unlike any other in the command structure. He did not lead troops. He did not devise battlefield tactics. His role was to stand between political ambition and military reality. Every major proposal passed through him. Every operational plan was examined for feasibility before resources were committed. When something did not survive scrutiny, he said so. This happened frequently. The Prime Minister wanted movement. He wanted action that could be explained to the public, to Parliament, to allies who were watching Britain's commitment. Delay felt like weakness. Hesitation felt like surrender by another name. But across the table sat someone who measured war differently. He did not oppose action. He opposed action that would fail. He had seen what happened when political urgency overrode logistical reality. He had watched operations collapse not because the enemy was stronger, but because the plan had assumed conditions that did not exist. His responses were consistent, blunt, sometimes repetitive. The forces are not ready. The supply lines cannot support this. The weather window is too narrow. This assumes coordination that has not been demonstrated. Each objection was documented. Each correction was precise, and each one slowed momentum. To some in the room, this felt like protection. To others, it felt like obstruction. The Prime Minister did not hide his frustration. He believed that war required boldness, that waiting for perfect conditions meant waiting forever. That decisive action, even with risk, was preferable to paralysis disguised as caution. The soldier sitting across from him believed something else. That modern war punished optimism faster than it punished hesitation. This was not a disagreement about facts. It was a disagreement about what mattered more, momentum or margin. And that disagreement was becoming intolerable. Not because anyone was wrong, but because the war had entered a phase where both perspectives could not coexist. The meetings continued. The plans were submitted. The objections were raised. But underneath the procedural calm, a question was forming. Not, is he right? But, can we afford him? The position Alan Brooke occupied had been created out of necessity, not tradition. In the early years of the war, Britain's command structure had been reactive. Decisions were made in response to immediate crises. Dunkirk, the Battle of Britain, the threat of invasion. There was no time for long-term planning because survival was measured in weeks, not campaigns. That phase had ended. By 1942, the immediate existential threat had receded. The Luftwaffe had not achieved air superiority. The invasion had not materialized. Britain remained intact, though diminished. The question was no longer whether it would survive, but what it would do with that survival. This shift required a different kind of command structure. Someone needed to translate political objectives into military operations. Someone needed to assess whether proposed actions were achievable with available resources. Someone needed to prevent enthusiasm from becoming catastrophe. Brooke's role was to be that filter. He was chief of the Imperial General Staff, the professional head of the British Army. But his real function was broader. He sat in the War Cabinet. He attended every major strategic meeting. He had direct access to Churchill, and he had the authority to say no. That authority was both necessary and dangerous. Necessary because modern war had become too complex for political instinct alone. Logistics determined what was possible more often than courage did. Supply chains, transport capacity, training timelines, equipment production, all of these constrained what armies could accomplish regardless of will. Dangerous because saying no repeatedly to a prime minister who believed in action created friction that compounded over time. The dynamic had worked during the defensive phase. When Britain was holding against superior force, caution was easily justified. Every resource mattered. Every miscalculation could be fatal. Restraint looked like wisdom. But once the defensive phase ended, restraint started looking different. Churchill saw opportunities. America had entered the war. Soviet forces were tying down German divisions in the east. North Africa was shifting in Britain's favor. The strategic picture was improving. And improvement demanded exploitation. He wanted operations that demonstrated Britain's commitment to offensive action. He wanted plans that would reassure allies and intimidate enemies. He wanted momentum that could be communicated, measured, celebrated. Brooke saw constraints. Every operation Churchill proposed required forces that were either not ready, not available, or not sustainable once deployed. Equipment was still being produced. Troops were still being trained. Transport ships were still scarce. The capacity to conduct one operation often meant sacrificing another. When Brooke reviewed proposals, he did not ask whether they were bold. He asked whether they would work. Could the forces reach the objective? Could they be supplied once there? Could they hold against counterattack? Could they be reinforced or evacuated if things went wrong? These questions were not rhetorical. They required detailed analysis. And that analysis often revealed gaps between ambition and capability. Churchill interpreted this as pessimism. He believed that focusing too much on constraints created a self-fulfilling paralysis. That if you waited for every condition to be perfect, you would never act. That war rewarded those who moved decisively, even imperfectly. Brooke interpreted Churchill's impatience as dangerous optimism. He had seen plans that looked decisive on paper collapse in execution. He had watched operations fail not because the enemy was brilliant, but because basic assumptions proved wrong. Weather delayed landings. Supply ships arrived late. Coordination between units broke down. Modern war punished assumptions ruthlessly. The gap between their perspectives was not philosophical. It was experiential. Churchill had spent the early war years managing political survival. He understood morale, narrative, and the importance of appearing strong. His instinct was to project confidence because projecting doubt invited collapse. Brooke had spent decades in military command. He understood what armies could sustain and what they could not. His instinct was to preserve force because wasted resources could not be replaced quickly. Both instincts were correct within their domains. But war planning required reconciling them. That reconciliation happened in meetings that became increasingly tense. Churchill would present an operation, often with passion, sometimes with impatience. He would frame it as urgent, achievable, necessary. Brooke would examine it, quietly, methodically. Then he would identify problems. The landing sites were not suitable for the equipment being used. The timeline assumed faster transport than was available. The enemy force estimate was outdated. The plan required air superiority that could not be guaranteed. Each objection was factual. Each one slowed the proposal. And each one reinforced Churchill's sense that boldness was being strangled by caution. The pattern repeated across multiple operations. Proposed raids on the French coast. Expeditions in Norway. Invasions in the Mediterranean. Each plan went through the same cycle. Proposal, review, objection, revision, delay. To Churchill, this felt like institutional resistance. To Brooke, it felt like preventing disaster. The problem was that preventing disaster generates no evidence. When an operation is blocked, no one can prove it would have failed. The counterfactual is invisible. Success that never happens cannot be celebrated. Failure that never occurs cannot be documented. Brooke's value lay entirely in what did not happen, and that made his contribution nearly impossible to measure in real time. What was visible was delay, momentum lost, opportunities real or imagined missed. Churchill began looking for ways around the process. Not openly, not by removing Brooke, but by creating alternative channels. He communicated directly with field commanders. He brought in outside advisors. He sought opinions that were less constrained by logistical concerns. This did not eliminate Brooke's role, but it reduced his influence. And that reduction revealed something about how command structures function under pressure. They tolerate restraint only as long as restraint appears necessary. Once the situation improved, once survival was no longer in question, restraint started looking like an obstacle rather than protection. Brooke understood this shift. He recorded it in his diary. He noted the increasing impatience, the bypassed consultations, the decisions made before his review was complete. He also understood that leaving his position would remove one of the few institutional checks on political urgency. So he stayed, and he continued saying no when the analysis demanded it. But the cost of saying no was accumulating, not in formal reprimand, not in public criticism, but in the quiet erosion of his authority, in the sense that his judgment, however accurate, was becoming inconvenient. By late 1942, the system that had created Brooke's role was beginning to outgrow its need for him, not because he had failed, but because the war had changed, and the new phase of the war required something different than what Brooke provided. It required the appearance of action, even when action was premature. That requirement would turn Britain's most essential general into its most expendable one. The meetings followed a pattern that everyone recognized but no one acknowledged directly. Churchill would arrive with a proposal already formed. Sometimes it had been discussed with others first, field commanders, political allies, advisors outside the formal chain. Sometimes it was presented as if consensus had already been reached elsewhere. Brooke would listen, take notes, ask questions. Then he would dismantle it, not emotionally, not theatrically, but systematically. The force allocation assumed units that were committed elsewhere. The timeline ignored weather patterns that made certain operations impossible during specific months. The supply requirements exceeded available transport capacity. The plan depended on enemy behavior that intelligence did not support. Churchill's response varied. Sometimes he argued. Sometimes he asked for alternatives. Sometimes he simply moved to the next topic, leaving the proposal unresolved but not withdrawn. The tension was not in what was said. It was in what accumulated between meetings. Each blocked proposal added to a growing sense that progress was being held hostage. Each delay reinforced Churchill's belief that caution had become an ideology rather than a method. Each revision felt like dilution, and Brooke, for his part, grew increasingly aware that being correct was not the same as being tolerated. His diary entries from this period reflect something beyond frustration. They reflect the recognition that his role was becoming untenable, not because he was failing at it, but because he was succeeding too well. Every operation he stopped might have been a disaster, but it also might have been a victory. The uncertainty cut both ways, and in the absence of proof, belief filled the gap. Churchill believed that boldness worked, that momentum mattered, that the appearance of strength could create actual strength by affecting enemy calculations and Allied confidence. Brooke believed that boldness without sustainability was just expensive failure deferred. Neither belief was provably wrong, and that made resolution impossible. By early 1943, the dynamic had shifted from professional disagreement to something more personal. Churchill began framing Brooke's objections not as technical concerns but as character flaws. Pessimism, excessive caution, an inability to see opportunity. The language in meetings changed. Questions about logistics were met with frustration about attitude. Brooke, in turn, began documenting not just the operational problems but Churchill's impatience with process itself. His diaries recorded instances where decisions were nearly made without proper review, where political pressure almost overrode military judgment, where momentum was valued more than feasibility. The conflict was no longer about individual operations. It was about control. Churchill wanted the authority to decide when caution was excessive. He believed his political judgment, his sense of what the moment required, should carry weight equal to military analysis. Brooke believed that military operations could not be bent to political timelines without accepting catastrophic risk. that logistics and capability were not opinions to be balanced against intuition. Both positions had merit. Both were also incompatible. The breaking point did not arrive suddenly. It accumulated across dozens of meetings, hundreds of proposals, countless small frictions that individually seemed manageable but collectively created an atmosphere of permanent tension. Churchill stopped asking Brooke for input on certain matters. He consulted him when required by protocol, but the consultation felt performative. Decisions were increasingly made in smaller groups, then presented to the full war cabinet as conclusions rather than proposals. Brooke noticed. He objected when appropriate. But objecting after a decision had been socialized among other leaders was different from objecting during formation. It looked like obstruction rather than oversight. The perception shifted. Where Brooke had once been seen as essential, the voice of reality in a room prone to optimism, he now began to be seen as limiting. As someone whose judgment, while often accurate, was preventing the kind of aggressive action the war now demanded. This perception was not universal. Many senior commanders valued Brooke's restraint. They understood that his caution had prevented operations that would have failed expensively. They knew that several of Churchill's proposals, if executed as initially conceived, would have resulted in disasters that could have altered the war's trajectory. But those commanders were not in the room where decisions were made. Churchill was, and Churchill's frustration was becoming harder to contain. There were moments when it surfaced directly. During one meeting in mid-1943, Churchill interrupted one of Brooke's assessments. "You are always seeing difficulties." Brooke's response was measured. "I am seeing the conditions that exist. Conditions can be changed by will. They can be ignored by will. That does not change them." The exchange was brief, but it crystallized the divide. Churchill believed in the power of decision to shape reality. That commitment, once made, created its own momentum and forced solutions to emerge. Brooke believed that reality constrained decision. That commitment to an impossible operation did not make it possible. It just made the failure more expensive. Neither man was entirely wrong, and neither could yield without abandoning the principle that made him effective. The meetings continued. The plans were still submitted for review. The process remained formally intact. But underneath, something had fractured. Churchill began speaking more openly, though still privately, about needing a different kind of military leadership. Not less competent, not less experienced, but less constrained by process. More willing to accept risk in exchange for initiative. He did not name Brooke explicitly, but the implication was clear. Brooke, for his part, began preparing for what he suspected was inevitable. Not dismissal, that would be too disruptive, but marginalization, a slow reduction of influence until his role became ceremonial rather than functional. He wrote about this possibility with surprising detachment. He did not seem angry. He seemed resigned to the logic of it. If my judgment is no longer wanted, I cannot force it to be considered. But I also cannot pretend that removing restraint will improve outcomes. That sentence, written privately in April 1943, captured the entire conflict. Brooke understood that his value was structural, not personal. The system needed someone to say no. But systems also expel the people who say no too often, especially when success starts to feel possible without them. By summer 1943, the tension had reached a point where something had to change. Churchill could not continue operating with a chief of the Imperial General Staff who opposed nearly every bold initiative. Brooke could not continue serving in a role where his judgment was routinely bypassed or overruled. But neither could act directly. Firing Brooke would require explanation. It would raise questions about why Britain's most experienced military leader was being removed during the most critical phase of the war. It would suggest instability in command at exactly the moment when Allied coordination required confidence. Keeping Brooke in place while ignoring him was equally untenable. It created confusion about who actually held authority. It allowed critical decisions to be made without proper review. The solution, when it emerged, was neither firing nor ignoring. It was something quieter. The changes began without announcement. In June 1943, A new advisor appeared in Churchill's inner circle. Not a replacement for Brooke, nothing so formal. Just someone whose opinion was sought more frequently. Someone whose assessments aligned more closely with Churchill's appetite for action. Lord Mountbatten had been elevated to Chief of Combined Operations earlier in the war. His role was to plan amphibious raids and coordinate inter-service operations. But by mid-1943, his access to Churchill had expanded beyond his formal responsibilities. He attended meetings where Brooke was not present. He provided assessments on operations that would normally pass through the Chief of the Imperial General Staff first. He offered opinions that were optimistic where Brooke's were cautious. Churchill began citing these alternative assessments when Brooke raised objections. Mountbatten believes this is achievable. Others see opportunity where you see risk. Not everyone shares your concerns about timing. The statements were not accusations. They were signals. Brooke's judgment was no longer the only judgment being considered. And increasingly, it was not the judgment being prioritized. This was not replacement. It was redundancy. By creating parallel channels of advice, Churchill could bypass Brooke without removing him. He could seek opinions more aligned with his instincts while maintaining the appearance that proper process was being followed. Brooke understood immediately what was happening. He noted it in his diary with remarkable clarity. The PM is building alternative structures. My assessments are still requested, but they are no longer definitive. I am being consulted for form, not function. He did not protest publicly. Protesting would have forced a confrontation that no one wanted. It would have required Churchill to either defend the bypass or justify removing Brooke outright. Neither option served anyone's interest, so the pattern continued. Brooke remained in his position. He continued attending meetings. He continued providing assessments. But his influence contracted. Operations he objected to moved forward anyway, justified by alternative analysis. Plans he requested be revised were implemented in their original form, supported by second opinions that Churchill had solicited specifically to counter Brooke's caution. The erosion was deliberate but deniable. No one said Brooke's judgment was wrong. They simply said it was not the only judgment. That in wartime, diverse perspectives were valuable. That caution was important but should not be paralyzing. The language was reasonable. The effect was neutralization. By August, Brooke's role had been functionally diminished. He still held his title. He still had formal authority. But that authority now required validation from others before it could block action. Where Brooke's objection had once been sufficient to halt a proposal pending revision, it now triggered a second review. And that second review, conducted by people selected for their willingness to accept risk, usually found ways to proceed. The system had adapted around him. Churchill achieved this without drama. There were no public disputes, no leaked disagreements, no official statements about changes in command philosophy. To outside observers, nothing had changed. The war cabinet still met. Brooke still attended. Churchill still consulted him. But inside the structure, everyone understood. Brooke's restraint was no longer governing. It was being managed. This created a new kind of tension. Not between Brooke and Churchill, but within Brooke himself. He could resign. That would be the clear response to being marginalized. It would signal that his judgment was incompatible with current command philosophy. It would force the system to choose between his approach and Churchill's. But resignation would also remove the last institutional brake on political urgency. However diminished his influence had become, Brooke's presence still forced some level of review. His questions still had to be answered, even if his objections could now be overridden. His assessments still created a record of what concerns had been raised before operations were launched. If he left, even that minimal friction would disappear. Brooke wrote about this calculation extensively. He was not dramatic about it. He did not frame it as martyrdom or duty. He framed it as a practical question. Would his absence make things worse? He concluded it would. So he stayed. But he also documented. His diary entries from late 1943 became more detailed. He recorded which proposals he had opposed and why. He noted which concerns had been dismissed and by whom. He tracked which operations proceeded despite his objections and what their outcomes were. He was building a record. Not for vindication, he never expressed interest in being proven right after the fact, but for accountability, so that if operations failed, there would be documentation of what warnings had been given. This was the behavior of someone who understood he had lost influence but refused to surrender responsibility. Churchill, for his part, never acknowledged the marginalization directly. He continued treating Brooke with formal respect. He continued including him in major meetings. He continued referencing his experience and expertise. But he also continued bypassing him when convenient. And he continued building relationships with military leaders who were more willing to accept risk. The dynamic was sustainable only because both men understood what was happening and chose not to force confrontation. Brooke would not resign because doing so would eliminate restraint entirely. Churchill would not fire him because doing so would create political problems and raise questions about command stability. So they continued working together in a relationship that had become functionally adversarial while remaining procedurally intact. By the end of 1943, the situation had stabilized into an uneasy equilibrium. Brooke's authority had been diluted. His objections could be overridden. His caution could be bypassed. But he remained in position. He remained consulted. He remained able to raise concerns, even if those concerns were no longer decisive. For Churchill, this was sufficient. He had regained the operational flexibility he wanted without the disruption of removing his chief of the Imperial General Staff. For Brooke, it was deeply unsatisfying but preferable to the alternative. He had lost control but retained presence. His influence had contracted but not disappeared. The question was whether that presence would matter. Whether diminished restraint was better than no restraint. Whether being overridden was better than being absent. Brooke believed it was. He stayed in his role through 1944, through D-Day, through the campaigns that followed. He continued raising objections. He continued documenting concerns. He continued providing assessments that were more cautious than Churchill wanted. And occasionally, not often, but occasionally, those objections still prevented disasters. Not the dramatic kind. Not the operations that would have failed spectacularly and visibly. But the quiet kind. The proposals that were adjusted slightly because Brooke raised a concern that could not be completely dismissed. The timelines that were extended by a few days because his logistics analysis identified a gap. The force allocations that were revised because his assessment revealed an assumption that did not hold. These changes were small. They were never celebrated. They generated no recognition. But they mattered. And the fact that they continued to matter, even after Brooke's influence had been systematically reduced, suggested something about the value of restraint that Churchill never fully accepted. That even diminished, even overridden, even marginalized, the presence of someone asking difficult questions still shaped outcomes. Not always, not decisively, but enough. Enough that Brooke's decision to stay, despite everything, was not futile, just mostly invisible. The war ended without settling the question. By May 1945, Allied victory was complete. Germany had surrendered. The campaigns Brooke had overseen, and the ones he had opposed, were now historical record. Outcomes were documented. Casualties were counted. Territory was secured. But the debate about whether restraint had helped or hindered remained unresolved. Churchill's supporters pointed to success. The Allies had won. Operations that Brooke had questioned, raids on the French coast, campaigns in Italy, the invasion of Normandy, had ultimately succeeded. The boldness Churchill advocated had, in their view, been vindicated by results. Brooke's supporters pointed to what had not happened. Operations that would have failed had been stopped or delayed. Resources that would have been wasted had been preserved. Disasters that would have occurred had been prevented by the friction Brooke created. Both arguments were correct. Both were also incomplete. The operations that succeeded had often succeeded in revised form, after Brooke's objections forced adjustments to timelines, force allocations, or logistics. The final plans bore little resemblance to the initial proposals Churchill had championed. But those revisions had come at the cost of momentum. Delays that might have prevented failure also eliminated opportunities that required speed. The question of whether the adjustments improved outcomes or merely made failure more expensive could not be answered definitively. What was clear was that Brooke's influence had shaped the war in ways that were nearly impossible to measure. He had not commanded armies in the field. He had not designed brilliant tactical maneuvers. He had not delivered stirring speeches that rallied public support. He had done something quieter. He had made recklessness harder. Every operation that passed through his review faced questions that slowed enthusiasm. Every bold proposal encountered friction that forced reconsideration. Every plan built on optimism had to survive contact with logistical reality before being executed. That friction prevented some disasters. It also delayed some victories. The net effect was unknowable. After the war, Brooke returned to private life with little public recognition. He was elevated to the peerage, Field Marshal Lord Alan Brooke, but the honor felt ceremonial. His wartime role was acknowledged but not celebrated. Historians would study his diaries decades later, but during his lifetime, his contribution remained largely invisible. Churchill's memoirs, published in the late 1940s and early 1950s, mentioned Brooke frequently but always with a tone of faint exasperation. He was described as capable, experienced, essential, but also cautious to the point of obstruction. The portrait was respectful but cool. Brooke's own diaries, published after his death, revealed the depth of tension that had existed. They showed a man who had spent years fighting not the enemy, but his own leadership's appetite for risk. They documented countless instances where operations were nearly launched without adequate preparation, where political urgency almost overrode military reality. The diaries did not portray Churchill as reckless. They portrayed him as someone who believed will could overcome constraint, who thought that boldness created its own solutions, who was frustrated by anyone who prioritized sustainability over initiative. That belief was not irrational. Sometimes boldness did work. Sometimes momentum mattered more than preparation. Sometimes acting imperfectly was better than waiting for perfect conditions. But sometimes it was not. And the problem was that no one could know in advance which situations demanded which approach. Brooke's legacy, such as it was, existed in that uncertainty. He had been right about some operations. The ones he stopped or delayed that would have failed catastrophically. But those failures never occurred, so they could never be proven. He had been wrong about others. The ones he opposed that succeeded anyway. But those successes had often been modified by his objections, making it unclear whether they would have worked in their original form. The ambiguity was permanent. What was not ambiguous was the cost of his role. Brooke had spent years being the person who said no, who raised objections, who complicated enthusiasm, who insisted that reality constrained ambition rather than the reverse. That position had made him essential. It had also made him exhausting. Churchill had wanted him gone not because he was incompetent, but because he represented a philosophy that was incompatible with the kind of leadership Churchill believed the moment required. Churchill believed in momentum, in action creating its own conditions for success, in the psychological impact of appearing strong and decisive. Brooke believed in sustainability, in operations that could be supported logistically, in avoiding failures that would undermine confidence and waste resources that could not be quickly replaced. Both beliefs had merit. Both had risks. Churchill's approach could produce spectacular success or spectacular failure. Brooke's approach could prevent disaster or prevent opportunity. The war had required both. But the system could not formally acknowledge that. It needed clear lines of authority, unified command philosophy, coherent direction. So it had marginalized Brooke while keeping him present. It had reduced his influence while maintaining his role. It had overridden his objections while continuing to consult him. That compromise had worked. Barely. But it left a question that extended beyond the war itself. What happens when the qualities that make someone indispensable also make them intolerable? Brooke's caution had protected Britain during its most vulnerable phase. But once that phase ended, the same caution became an obstacle to the aggressive action the next phase demanded. His judgment had prevented disasters, But preventing disaster is invisible. It generates no narrative of success. It creates no story that can be told to sustain morale or justify sacrifice. Churchill understood narrative. He understood that wars are fought as much through belief as through material. That armies need to believe victory is possible. That publics need to see progress. That allies need confidence in commitment. Brooke understood systems. He understood that belief without capability produced expensive failure. That progress without sustainability was temporary. That commitment without resources was performance. The tension between those understandings never resolved. After the war, as memories solidified into history, the debate continued in academic circles. Military historians argued about whether Brooke's restraint had been necessary or excessive, whether Churchill's impatience had been visionary or dangerous. The arguments were sophisticated. They examined specific operations. They analyzed counterfactuals. They weighed evidence carefully, but they could not answer the fundamental question. At what point does restraint become obstruction? Because the answer depended on outcomes that could never be tested, on operations that were never launched, on failures that never occurred, on opportunities that were never pursued. Brooke had spent years making those decisions, blocking proposals he believed would fail, delaying operations he thought were premature, insisting on preparation that felt excessive to others. He had been proven right often enough to justify his approach, but not so often that his approach was universally accepted. And that ambiguity defined his legacy. He was the general Churchill wanted gone, not because he had failed, but because success no longer required the kind of restraint he represented. Or perhaps it did, and the system had simply lost the patience to tolerate it. The question remained unresolved when Brooke died in 1963. It remained unresolved in the decades that followed. Because the problem Brooke represented was not unique to World War II. It was structural. Every command system faces the same tension. Between boldness and caution, between momentum and sustainability, between the leaders who push forward and the ones who prevent collapse. Both are necessary. Both are also frequently incompatible. And the system's ability to balance them determines not just whether wars are won, but how much they cost, and whether the victory survives the methods used to achieve it. Brooke understood this. His diaries make it clear that he never expected gratitude. He never sought recognition for disasters prevented. He understood that his contribution was, by its nature, invisible. What he did expect was that someone would continue asking the questions he had asked. That restraint would remain part of command philosophy. That enthusiasm would not be mistaken for strategy. Whether that expectation was met is unclear. What is clear is that Churchill wanted him gone. Not entirely, not publicly, but functionally. And the fact that he was never fully removed, that he remained in position despite everything, suggests that even Churchill understood, on some level, that the restraint he found so frustrating was also necessary. Just not necessary enough to be tolerated without resistance. That is the unresolved tension at the heart of Brooke's story. He was indispensable and expendable simultaneously, essential and inconvenient, right often enough to be kept, but uncomfortable enough to be contained. And the war succeeded not by resolving that contradiction, but by managing it. Barely.